Thanks everyone. I know I'm standing between you and getting home on a nice Friday afternoon. My intention with the next 10 or 15 minutes is just to give you a run over the zero carbon bill. There's been a lot of this talk about the focus on targets, but there are a few different aspects to the zero carbon bill which I just want you to leave here today with a fairly good understanding of, in the hope that you may individually or through Dairy NZ or through others be making submissions to us. As Joe said, I'm a manager for climate policy at MFE. I look after ETS operational issues, not forestry and agriculture. There's no direct linkage between those two things. I should stress in terms of those two work portfolios. And I look after adaptation issues as well, which is basically addressing the impacts of climate change. Today, moving straight along, actually, maybe before I get into the slide, there's a few different aspects to the zero carbon bill. What the bill, in a nutshell, tries to do is, given that we have commitments under the Paris Agreement, is to set ourselves some certainty around where we're going to be in the future. So it proposes to write into the legislation an emissions reduction target for 2050. So that's obviously a big part of the bill. We have this agreement under Paris. Paris commits all countries to be moving towards net zero emissions by the second part of this century. So by 2050, it proposes that we would set our own target in New Zealand, a domestic target. What should that be? 2050 is a long way away, so it also proposes a series of emission budgets, which is basically the intermediate step. So over the next 5 years, we would have an emission budget which clearly begins to set ourselves on a trajectory towards 2050. There's questions here around who sets the budgets, how long into the future do you set them, how flexible should they be, how much predictability do we want. Then there's questions around, well, if you set emission budgets, you've got a target, you've got emission budgets, you have to have plans to meet them. You don't just set a target, you have to have some way of following it up. Behind all this is the role of the Climate Change Commission, which I'll come and talk to in the next 10 minutes. And there are also a number of adaptation measures, which sometimes go under the radar here, but are equally important for this discussion. So it's looking at what can we be doing or should we be doing in this bill to ensure that over the next 20, 50 years, not only are we bringing our emissions down, but that we're a more climate resilient economy, or the economy is more resilient to impacts of climate change. So, which target is right for New Zealand? There are in the discussion paper, which if many of you have not yet got or would like to see, which is basically behind my presentation and is available online, there are 3 targets that have been proposed. The first is a net zero carbon dioxide target, i.e. we focus on carbon dioxide specifically within the target. You looked at 2050 to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by as much as possible, offset net zero in this case would mean offset remaining carbon dioxide by 2050 with new tree planting. This target does not of itself mean that agricultural emissions, methane and nitrous oxide are ignored. It just means they're not specifically addressed within the target. Clearly, we would still have measures with relation to agricultural emissions, but they would not be captured under this target. The second is the one which is quite relevant to the discussion we've been having this morning around net zero being net zero for long-lived gases and stabilised short-lived gases, i.e. stabilising, bringing down, reducing carbon dioxide, which is the long-lived gas, and nitrous oxide, but stabilising methane emissions as a short-lived gas, given its different nature, as it's a flow gas rather than a stock gas, and we've heard about the differences between methane and carbon dioxide and to what extent we should treat them differently in our policy approaches. So this target would mean effectively similar to the previous one, but with the focus of bringing in nitrous oxide and methane, reducing nitrous oxide, stabilising methane, offset remaining carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide with new tree planting. And the third one is net zero emissions, which effectively means everything's in the same basket. We're reducing carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane, and any remaining gases in 2050 would be offset with new tree planting. this is, I guess, one of the key issues for consultation. Where is the preference? Where should we be going? What sort of target should we be looking for? I think, again, we've been on the road now for 2 weeks, so I can give you, a bit of a flavour of the discussion. When we talk about net zero carbon dioxide, you automatically get this response, well, is agriculture off the hook? Why are we even considering it? But it does imply a focus on the long-lived gas carbon dioxide. The net zero long-lived gases and stabilised short-lived gases has got a lot of attention from the primary sector's industries, because it specifically looks at methane in a different way than it looks at nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. There is a question, though, in this, when we say about stabilising methane, does that mean reducing methane and stabilising it, or stabilising it effectively? If we went this middle option, we would still have a discussion around at what level we would be stabilising methane. As we heard from Elena, there is a trade-off between the more we can reduce methane emissions in the near future, there's a trade-off for what degree of effort we will need to do for our long-lived gases of CO2 and nitrous oxide. So that's a fairly important discussion to be had if we were to go the so-called split gases option. And then finally, there's the one which is perhaps the most comprehensive and the most ambitious, which is the net zero emissions target. Opportunities and challenges with these. I guess the point has been made, and it was made in relation to the forestry sector as well, that with a lot of these measures we do, obviously there are co-benefits. So we're not only doing them with the idea of methane, of reducing emissions and reducing our impact on the climate, but moving on this sort of transition to a low emissions economy by 2050 would create business opportunities in low emission sectors. It can give us cleaner air, cleaner water, greater biodiversity, improved health, higher rates of innovation and productivity, as well as reduced impact on climate change. But not to overlook the challenges. I guess if it was that easy, we'd be doing it already. So clearly there are challenges in moving to any of those targets. The economic modelling we've done shows that for the targets, with those, that they are certainly doable, but they do present challenges, and that there would be, the economy will continue to grow at a fairly healthy rate. Tracking to net zero by 2050 would mean a reduction in, a minor reduction in GDP rates compared to not doing anything at all. GDP per capita over those 30 years. And as well as the macro impacts across the economy, clearly, depending on which target you're looking at, there are sector-specific challenges. Some sectors in the economy will be more challenged by these targets than others. And that includes the high emission sectors, and that necessarily includes the dairy sector. Other challenges include land use changes, changes in transport, very significantly the potentially uneven household impacts. And clearly there would be, any measure like this tends to impose costs on low household incomes, and so the government will need to look at how it addresses those. This is the economic, and this is the modelling looks at, and maybe I'll come back to that. Can I come back to that at the end? Because there may be a couple of related questions, then I can take it once and they get too difficult, I'll throw them to Ben, who can help me out. So where was I? Challenges. And then again, I guess this is the other issue here around, we can agree where we want to get to by 2050, but then within that we need to make decisions around the pathway there, and this is where the discussion on emission budgets comes. So clearly, the earlier we take action, we can take action early, push on fairly quickly, or we could delay that action, which would require us taking it later in that sort of 2040 or 2050 period, for example. You may be assuming by doing so that certain technology options, e.g. a vaccine for methane, come onto the market in that later time frame. So that's a decision to be had, and that brings me to the question on these intermediate targets, these emission budgets. And these are also set out in the bill, that effectively we don't just set a target to 2050, but we'll be setting up so-called emission budgets for, we are proposing over a five-year period, you set 3 budgets in a row, so you have a sort of a 15-year period of certainty around where you're tracking in the next 15 years. And what a budget means is effectively a quantification of emissions in New Zealand for that period of time. So this is the sort of accounting metric we use in our international reporting. And you would clearly want to start tracking it down in relation to your long-term target. What effectively is being proposed here is that by having these budgets in place, you give industry and everyone some certainty around what's going to be happening. But clearly, events can happen, so there has to be some flexibility as well. So we're having a discussion around, well, if you set 3 budgets into the future, when can an existing government, a current government, under what circumstances could they change or alter one of these budgets? Slightly technical stuff, but significant. And similarly, you move into the cycle where after every 5 years, in 2025, you would set the 4th budget period. So you always have 3 budgets in place. The Climate Change Commission, the institutional factor behind the Zero Carbon Bill, if you like. So we've seen, I guess, if you look back over the last 20 years, quite an evolution of climate policy with different proposals coming in, carbon taxes coming in and not coming in, and then methane taxes being proposed and not being proposed, and ETS coming in and then being revised. So the intention of Climate Change Commission is to set up an independent expert body that would give us longer term certainty around some of this decision making. The key questions if you set up an independent commission are whether it would have an advisory role or decision making role, and in relation to what. And some people ask me about this question, well, what do you mean? Is this just basically replacing one group of grey-haired men in Wellington with another group of grey-haired, well, hopefully not just men, but men and women. And so what's the issue here? But effectively, the issue is if you're thinking commissions that we have a Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, which has purely an advisory role. We have a Commerce Commission, which has some decision-making power, some teeth, and we have like the Reserve Bank, which has very strong autonomy around setting monetary policy. So there is a model here, there is a choice to be made around what powers this commission would have around setting climate policy in the future. There are questions around the roles, in particular in relation to the emissions trading scheme. And this would largely perhaps be of interest depending on what future government decisions may be about agriculture's inclusion in the ETS or not. But regardless, given that we've sort of seen quite a bit of policy variability with the ETS, are there advantages to giving that role around the policy settings of the emissions trading scheme to this independent commission, effectively take it away from the government's hands and give it to an independent commission? And by taking it away, the question is it purely advisory or is it actually a decision-making power? And finally, there are the adaptation measures. And this has been a relatively sweet sailing part of our consultation so far, because regardless of the discussion about what's causing climate change, most people are aware that we are seeing or we are experiencing changes in climatic patterns. And there is a concern about our degree of preparedness for that climate impact across the economy. So what's being proposed, and just to explain these 2 measures, is that we would do a national climate change risk assessment. And in very simple terms, we have different sorts of assessments of risks in different parts of the country at the moment. So certain councils know pretty well what the impacts of sea level rise may be, or extreme or water surges or flooding events. But we don't have a picture across the economy, and those local pictures of risk are quite different depending on where they're done. So it has been brought to our attention that we need an economy-wide analysis. We need to be taking into issues such as biosecurity risks, health risks, across the economy, across all sectors, so that we can make some more informed decision making. So the bill would therefore require government to do, or require there to be done, a national climate change risk assessment regularly every 5 years. That would inform the National Adaptation Plan, which will also be done regularly every 5 years. And plan sounds fairly high level, bureaucratic, but it would basically be ensuring that we are in a better place to address some of those risks that we're seeing than we are at present. I've moved along fairly quickly, but I think that's all bonus time for questions, right? So, in summary, we are trying to set this New Zealand's long-term commitment to a low emissions economy and get the building blocks in place to make sure we get there. Any of the options have important implications for agriculture, particularly the type of target we set, and the choices around an independent commission and what its powers will be also have relevance for all the sectors of the economy, as do the adaptation measures which are being proposed. So I know I had the question from the back of the room today around how do we make submissions. I think it's clearly the submissions process is open now. We've been on the road for 2 weeks. I think, Ben, it's till about July 16, isn't it? Yeah. So, yep. We've received something like, I wrote down the number, 1,300 submissions to date. Some of them are very comprehensive, some of them are very short. So I totally encourage everyone in the room, either through DRNZ or individually, please have your say. Thank you.